As the world got ready for its first relatively normal Halloween of the decade, there was something else brewing in the October air of 2023. As the hype from Taylor Swift's Eras Tour calmed down, theaters were preparing for a completely different phenomenon. One that centered around a bear named Freddy. Five Nights at Freddy's was already a powerhouse of an intellectual property before it hit the big screen, with a long series of games and even several novels written about the haunted animatronics. But the movie which had hit theaters that October was the first time fans could truly see the creatures, and the pizzeria they inhabit, brought to life. With the sequel on its way out at the end of this week, as you might be watching as it's airing, I thought it might be prudent to take a look back at the first film and see how it was made. So join me in that journey and we can find out just what it took to make the movie Five Nights at Freddy's. Five Nights at Freddy's, take one.
With the adaptation of Five Nights at Freddy's, you know going into it that the world is rich and incredible and frightening.
The game is very creepy. It's very intense, and we're trying to bring as much of that as possible into the filmmaking process as well.
I think the film was important to be made because fans have been clamoring for it for a long time, and I am thrilled to finally give them what they want.
The first Five Nights at Freddy's game was released in the summer of 2014. The game generated such a strong popularity that there were 7 sequel games that were made, with several spin-offs and even a series of novels. But I'll be honest with you, that's about as much as I can tell you with any level of confidence. The world of Five Nights at Freddy's is incredibly diverse and it is insanely deep. Far more so than I would ever feel comfortable trying to cover, even if I had a year to go into it. But let's talk about how that process came to life on the silver screen. On April 7th of 2025, The Hollywood Reporter published an article saying that a Five Nights at Freddy's film was in the writing process, with rights for the adaptation purchased by Warner Brothers from Scott Cawthon, the creator of the IP. This iteration of the project had Roy Lee of Vertigo Entertainment attached to produce, along with Seth Grahame-Smith and David Katzenberg of Catsmith Productions. The Vertigo and Catsmith teams were involved with a Beetlejuice sequel that unfortunately never made it to the screen, and also a version of Stephen King's It that unfortunately was also never produced. In 2017, Warner sold the rights to Blumhouse after failing to reach a consensus on a script. In 2018, a new script had been penned by Gremlins screenwriter and Harry Potter director Chris Columbus, which Jason Blum of Blumhouse loved, but Scott Cawthon did not. Scott took to Twitter to communicate with the fans directly, stating, "Okay guys, I had a script written, Jason liked it, and Chris Columbus liked it too, but I tossed it. I had a different idea for it, one that I liked better. I take responsibility for the delay, it is my fault. I'm determined to find the right story. I'm sticking to what I've always said. Either the right movie gets made, or no movie gets made. I hate delaying a project that's already seen so many delays, but I have to go with my instincts on what I think will be exciting and interesting, and what I think the fan base will really want to see. If that means I have to start over 10 more times, then that's what I'm gonna do." The good thing is, each attempt gets better and better in my opinion. So despite the delays, it's going in the right direction. By early 2021, Scott confirmed that they would begin production that spring. Jason Blum spoke with Collider confirming that Cawthon had a final say on the script, so the delays were very much the result of ensuring that the creator of the original IP was happy with the product. Scott's previous confirmation on development seemed to be a little premature, as it wasn't until October 2022 that the film actually started gaining momentum and rolling into production. At that time, it was announced that Emma Tammi would be directing, along with assisting Cawthon and Seth Cuddeback with writing the film, and that Jim Henson's Creature Shop would be producing the puppets of the animatronic creatures. By the way, this was not an intentional plan. I didn't expect that the first 2 films I'd be covering on this channel would be puppet films. Next one's not. Next one's Heat. Little sneak preview. That's coming next week. 2 weeks from now. Unintended, unintentional, interesting. Moving on. Jim Henson was the renowned creator of The Muppets, and his Creature Shop has developed characters for a variety of films and television, such as Labyrinth, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Where the Wild Things Are, and dozens more. The director, Emma Tammi, was raised in New York City by 2 parents in the acting world, and made her feature directing debut with The Wind in 2018, a Western horror of a woman being tormented by demons on the prairie. This is after having co-directed Fair Chase with Alex Cullen and Election Day Lens Across America with Henry Jacobs Jacobson. Prior to her set leadership roles, Tammi interned with renowned filmmaker Robert Altman during and after her college years. Despite the youth of her career, Jason Blum, the founder and CEO of Blumhouse Productions, approached her about taking on the task of directing Five Nights at Freddy's. After some initial research, Tammi said yes. Emma, Seth, and Scott worked together to expand the world of Five Nights at Freddy's for the plot of the film by diving deeper into the emotional backstories of the characters, to help the audience develop a connection with the people on screen, and to provide a deeper meaning to the existing material. This is not an uncommon occurrence, particularly with existing IPs. An example that immediately comes to mind would be 2014's Godzilla, where they introduced a number of characters and storylines to help ground the events happening around the gargantuan kaiju. Granted, many believe that that film went a little too far with the human stories and not showing enough of the Lizard King himself, but I personally like the unique take on it. And I'm not lying, because after I wrote that line, I went and rewatched the film, and I can confirm I still enjoy it. Definitely get where people are coming from, especially with, the way Godzilla movies usually function, but really kind of enjoyed the different take. I'm a weird person, I like the different takes on things. But yeah, not lying, still really enjoy that movie. Anyway, quickly following Tammi's addition, casting began with the addition of Josh Hutcherson as Mike Schmidt and Matthew Lillard as William Afton, which during the marketing, he was marketed as somebody else, and that ended up not working out because fans immediately recognized him as being William Afton. Again, interesting bit about the deep lore of FNAF that, I don't know, it just reminds me a lot of like the Cloverfield ARGs. I think I brought that up last time. I'm vehemently impressed with how deep this world goes. Anyway, Lillard accepted the role after meeting with Emma and learning more about the 3-film plan and what his character was going to be about, and that he was basically the Voldemort of this franchise. And especially after coming home and seeing his kid's reaction to the opportunity that was in front of him. Pretty much saying that, there was an interview where he was talking about essentially his kids were like, you have to do this. And, he had already been pretty much swayed at that point, but that was enough to, even if he wasn't interested previously, it's your kids. Another casting addition was Elizabeth Lail as Vanessa, which is another character from the games that will be familiar to fans. Elizabeth has made an exceptional career for herself with long-standing series roles in both ABC's Once Upon a Time and Netflix's You. Child actress Piper Rubio plays Abby, who is Mike's younger sister and the object of focus for the ghostly animatronics throughout the film. Rubio has credits going back to 2019, where she played 4-year-old Charlotte on the TV series Coop and Cammy Ask the World. I'm not gonna lie, learning that someone born the year I was a freshman in high school is on the verge of becoming a teenager themselves was a wild thing to realize while writing this, but I digress. Mary Stuart Masterson does a great job of playing the ruthless Aunt Jane, along with her accomplices played by Kat Connor Sterling, David Lind, Joseph Poliquin, and Christian Stokes. Arguably my favorite character in the film, however, is that of Doug, played by routine character and background actor Michael P. Sullivan. His moments just really add a comedic flair, and he has such a good look on his face whenever the camera cuts to him. It's like he'd rather be literally anywhere else, but he knows he has to be there for the paycheck that this crazy aunt is willing to pay him. He's great. I love him. I want to see him in more stuff. Phenomenal. Lynn Moncrief was also hired as the cinematographer for the film. He has feature film credits dating back to 2005 with the movie Stillwater, and a variety of shorts, series, and features filling out the catalog up to when he and Tammi worked together for the first time on her debut, The Wind. Rounding out the notable names in this film, there are a series of cameos by YouTubers in the FNAF community, such as Koryax Keshin appearing as the cab driver, while 8-Bit Ryan, Bazlaman, Razbowski, Dawko, and Fusion Z Gamer appear more briefly as past employees of the month at Freddy Fazbear's. Now, with all the main names assembled, it's time to officially start rolling into pre-production. One aspect of the film that adds to the immersion, even beyond which the games provide, is that they have characters moving throughout the pizzeria as opposed to remaining within the security room. Mark Fisichella, the production designer, decided early in the pre-production process to build the pizzeria as a single set, building out a layout of the game's map as a massive location. Normally things would be broken up by room, but he wanted the ability for the set and the production to flow together. The director noted that this really helped with immersion for the cast. The scale also provided an amazing maze-like quality to the set, helping to make it difficult to know where exactly in the space you were from the audience's perspective. Moncrief, the cinematographer, discussed frequently with Mark about where the light would be coming from throughout each scene, allowing for a symbiotic relationship between the camera department and the production designer, to help incorporate practical lights where possible. Mark notes in one of the behind-the-scenes featurettes on the Blu-ray that as a part of the lighting plan, they focused not only on standard lighting scenarios, but also how those lighting plans could be minimally altered to create identifiable silhouettes, or even moments where the characters would only be visible in a momentary flash. Mark adds that they took great care to add as many details and Easter eggs as possible for the sake of the fans, such as the cup and the fan on the security desk, to even an illuminated sign with the rainbow character on the soda machine. The director, Tammi, adds that they also tried to add things they thought the fans might appreciate that were new, like the Employee of the Month wall, and especially having Matt Pat play the diner scene waiter. With the set assembled, the next step was arguably the most important, finding a way to bring the ghostly animatronics of the game into real life. In an interview with NBC Insider, Tammi confirms that she decided very early on in the process to go practical for the portrayal of the animatronics from the game, as it fit with the goal of the scares emanating from their presence in the physical chase of their victims, and with the temporal setting of the film, which takes place in the 2000s, just as the games do. Lead supervisor at Jim Henson's, Robert Bennett, told NBC Insider that much like with the process we saw last time on the making of The Corpse Bride, the first thing he did in producing the puppets was to make highly detailed maquettes of each character to be able to work with Tammi on honing the overall aesthetics of the design and the abilities and limitations of their mobility. Bennett describes the process in the following quote: "We had to make multiples of each character so that when we're on site on the day, if Chica needs to be in this shot, but then the next shot is doing something completely different, we can build another one before that shot, or we can take this one apart and reassess it to get it to do what we need it to do." In general, there were duplicates of each character. We built kits, so there weren't just 2 arms. There might have been 6 or 12 arms for one character. Same with the legs and all the extremities. All the fittings were universal so that we could switch out really fast on set. We'd be setting up a specific shot and look at it, and we would adjust even if Chica's arm gauntlet was just a little off. Bennett also added in the Blu-ray featurette that every detail down to the colors and design of the eyes is chosen to adhere as closely as possible to the source material. Puppet production involved a lot of trial and error to figure out different materials and the levels of weathering for the suits. One North Star was to keep in mind that if these animatronics were supposedly built in the 1980s, what kind of materials would they have been using and how? Wolfgang Criswell, lead animatronics wrangler, notes that when designing the puppets, they organized them to figure out what would make sense from an animatronic perspective within them, and then built out the software from that structure. Atri Esposito, the puppeteer captain and puppeteer for Freddy, notes that for Foxy, they built it in a full animatronic, which took 6 puppeteers to operate. 1 for the head, 1 for the face, 1 for the arms, 2 for the feet, and 1 for the rig which moves the entire puppet up and down. As the designs of the creatures carried on, the camera department was in the process of deciding the best means and technology to capture the action of the humans and animatronics most effectively. For this picture, the team inevitably decided on using the Alexa 65 camera platform for this production, with DNA, Heroes, and vintage 765 lenses to round out the package. In an article on Ari's rental website, Moncrief discusses the process of deciding what camera and why they chose for a given production. He notes in this quote by saying, "The first thing we do when we break a film down is decide our rules for the movie. For example, the camera only moves when a certain threat appears, or we use specific lenses for a particular perspective. Emma wanted visual separation between life outside Freddy's, the world inside Freddy's, and the dreams and flashbacks. But by the end, they have all melded together." Lynn, Emma, and the production team looked at both the Alexa LF and Alexa 65 and inevitably chose the Alexa 65 for a very practical reason. According to Lynn, Emma's filming style leads towards framing shots that are both wide, in terms of how much in the space is captured around the characters, and physically close to those subjects, meaning that there's little distance between the actors and the camera. Kind of like that. This, in general, is a bit of a paradoxical goal. The closer you get to a subject, the less of the background around that subject you're going to see. Now, the way to compensate for that is by going for a wider lens, such as a 24 or a 21mm, but if you go any lower than that, like into the teens, like the 18 or 14mm sizes, you're going to start to get exponentially more lens distortion. And considering the production team didn't want the film to look like a 90s music video that was shot on a fisheye, they needed a solution. And this is where the LF, and specifically the Alexa 65, shine. The major difference between the Alexa Classic, which is what I have right here, this is the Alexa XT, and the Alexa LF and the Alexa 65 is the size of the sensor capturing the image data. The Alexa Classic has a Super 35 sensor, which means it has a sensor roughly the same size as a frame of Super 35 film, allowing for easy transfer of classic lenses used throughout much of the history of cinema to still be used to this day. And for context, 35mm is generally the standard for most productions, especially in the latter half of the 20th century. Most films that you've watched made by a studio were shot on 35mm. If it was anything more or less than that, it usually is denotable in the credits, or it's visible because smaller films are going to have way more grain, like 16mm is very grainy, Super 8 very grainy, and then larger films less grainy. We'll get into that in a minute. The Alexa LF sensor, on the other hand, is double the size of a Super 35 sensor, with two of the LEV 3 sensors stacked next to each other. This is great for increasing resolution and capture area of the frame, but the downside is the increased space is often not fully covered by old cinema glass designed for Super 35 coverage areas. So special larger lenses are often needed. Granted, you could crop in on an LF sensor to a Super 35 area, but at that point you're just kind of wasting money and technology, and you might as well just be using an Alexa Classic. But thankfully, especially nowadays, there are so many lenses for larger sensor sizes that, you know, there's plenty to choose from. Stepping one more above the Alexa LF is the Alexa 65, which is triple the size of the Alexa Classic sensor, with three of the LEV 3 sensors stacked vertically next to each other. The 65 in the Alexa 65 nomenclature is both literal and homage. The horizontal measurement of the sensor clocks in at 6,560 pixels, creating a 6.5K image, and the 65 is also homage to the renowned 65mm cameras of old, which, like the digital counterpart, had film strips over 3 times larger than that of the 35mm standard, providing greater area of capture and superior detail retention. You may be more familiar with its print nomenclature of 70mm from films like The Hateful Eight, which is what 65mm captures are printed onto, in order to provide extra film space for the audio tracks along the side. There are a wide variety of 65 and 70mm capture types and film formats, the most popular today being IMAX, which is 70mm captured horizontally to increase space available and decrease the complexity of the mechanics involved in rolling that large of a film through the camera and around the spools that hold it. If you weren't aware, most film cameras film vertically through the two spools, imagining like this camera on the side, the little like spool packs up top, the film would run through and then go back up to the opposite spool. But so because that was the general standard for almost every camera, that's what made the IMAX so, you know, interesting and unique in the fact that it goes horizontal. I don't know if there are any other horizontal cameras. There may be a couple, but IMAX is one of the few. Given that the Alexa 65 sensor was 33% bigger than the LF and triple that of the standard Alexa, it was the natural choice for this production. Next, they just needed to find lenses big enough to cover the sensor area. Thankfully, ARRI had them covered. The production was serviced by ARRI Rental New Orleans with support from the LA branch. I mentioned their names earlier, but we'll cover a little bit more about the specifics of why they chose those lenses and their intentional use cases throughout the production a little bit later in the video. For now, it's time to dive into production. Shooting commenced in New Orleans in early 2023, both on location in the surrounding areas and in studio for the internal pizzeria set pieces. Fun little factoid here, the first scene of the entire film that was shot was the portion in the diner with the aunt and the accomplices, but most notably with the cameo from MatPat, who is the creator of the Theorist channels on YouTube and a major member in the FNAF community. In one of the Blu-ray featurettes, and I think a few of the interviews for the film, director Emma Tammi noted that Matt aced his performance. She went on to add that the most difficult part of the production was learning how to direct the animatronics and the multiple puppeteers behind each one of them. She was quoted as saying, "It was this huge team collaboration alongside me, as I was directing the actors in the scenes if they were in the same scenes as the animatronics. So that was like a whole other muscle to start flexing. But it felt so fun and collaborative and something I really would enjoy doing again down the line. Bobby was still tweaking the puppets alongside the rest of the team throughout all of the production, even up to the last day. The presence of the puppets was an added anxiety for the director, but to her surprise, they didn't run into any major delays as a result. She notes that such a success is a testament to the talents and geniuses at Jim Henson Studios. Now, a fun little aside here for most film buffs is that there probably is a subconscious at minimum or just indirect reference here to the classic stories about what happened with Jaws and the animatronic shark just not ever working at all. There are a variety of other productions that have had animatronic issues, but that is the one that kind of every filmmaker credits as being like hell on earth for a production. So I'm sure in the back of her mind, along with anybody else who works with animatronics, that production comes to mind. And so with particular, reason and interest, I'm not surprised that she was surprised that it went as well as it did. For the protagonist of the film, Josh Hutcherson's goal as the performer was to ground the character as much as possible, given the two differentiating tones of the film, that of the human story and of the haunted animatronics. Despite his extensive experience with CGI from the Hunger Games series, he noted that he was nervous when he first walked onto set, worried about how difficult it might be to work with the animatronics and provide a solid performance. But to his surprise, he found that the moment he started to interact with them, the reactions came naturally. Of course, the most important performances in the entire production came from the talented team of performers within the animatronics themselves, both the puppeteers who generated the facial emotions externally and the stunt performers actually in the suits. Kevin Foster, the stunt performer for Freddy Fazbear, notes that the most challenging thing about the performance was that it was less like performing in a costume, but rather akin to driving. Foster has a prolific career in a wide variety of films and television shows. From asking Tony Stark for a picture in the beginning of the first Iron Man film, to beating up Jake Gyllenhaal in Jarhead, to making guest appearances on some of my personal favorite television shows, like Castle and The Mentalist. Jade Kindar Martin, the suit performer for Bonnie, adds that the suits themselves aren't incredibly heavy, but the heads are, and remaining in a specific position for minutes on end can get rather tiring. Martin has a prolific stunt career, and most notably was Joseph Gordon-Levitt's double in the 2015 film The Walk. Jess Weiss, the Chica suit performer, clarifies that the heads are approximately 16 pounds, and they have extremely limited visibility. Weiss herself has a strong career both in front of the camera and behind the scenes, filling roles for production support and as a stunt performer. Foster noted that Andy Dillon, the stunt coordinator for the picture, suggested one of the producers that they should do stunt people in the suits rather than actors. The producer agreed, and Andy started searching for the stunt performers. Just as a little aside, the stunt coordinator was responsible for all things stunt related on the picture, which includes hiring the talent for the stunts. So once he got the green light from the producer, the rest was up to him, aside from final approval. YouTuber Razbowski, as part of a 3-day set experience for those creators within the Five Nights at Freddy's community, was able to sit down with Kevin, Jess, and Jade to discuss their experiences performing in the animatronic suits. Much of the following anecdotes are a direct result of a streamlined version of that interview, but I highly recommend checking out the video on Razbowski's channel interviewing the animatronics exclusive FNAF movie vlog for the full content and stories behind their experiences. Kevin added that standing is one of the hardest parts, as sway and movement would give away that there are people in the suits. And one trick that he used was to look through the cracks in the suit and find the furthest horizon, and watch for movement and changes, constantly flexing and relaxing different muscles to try and keep it as still as possible. For Jess in the Chica suit, the hardest part was holding Cupcake. Despite it being a stunt cupcake that was far less weight than the real animatronic, and having support structure within the suit itself to help alleviate the weight, she notes that it was like holding up a dictionary. Matthew Lillard adds in one of the featurettes that within the limitations, you start to use your silhouette as a reference, along with the reactions of the suit to your body and the reactions of the performers around you to start making decisions that go beyond just the movements, delving into the revelation of character through those movements. At one point, the strap for a guitar on Bonnie snuck its way into a crack in the suit, forcing Jade's head to the side, unable to move. He and the animatronic team quickly reacted and found the source of the problem, but it's another good indicator of how difficult it can be to control even some of the best constructed suits in the industry. Kevin adds that when in the suit, when something goes wrong and suddenly your body wants to do something unusual, you have no idea what the cause is, and you have to have help and use a process of elimination to figure it out. He gives a tidbit on how he had a similar issue to Jade where suddenly he had his head turning to the right, and it took multiple steps to try and figure out what it was. Turns out it was just that one of the 4 chin straps on the helmet had loosened. Jade also made a point of noting that there is a 15-minute soft limit between when the head goes on and when they get a break, as coordinated by Andy and the stunt performing team. Kevin added that sometimes they'll push through that time limit, especially if it's the last shot of the day, which, for the first time in my life, I heard referenced as the martini shot, which is pretty self-explanatory in nickname, and I personally love and will definitely be using as nomenclature in the future. Now that may just be a result of my lack of experience in the more formal aspects of the industry, but I digress. Kevin also added that the more straining shots will be much shorter time frames, and recalls one setup where he was only able to manage about 3 minutes before needing a break. The 15-minute cutoff is a suggestion, and then they go from there based on the needs and limitations of a given shot. Jade clarifies that it's a good baseline though, as when the 10 to 15 minute mark comes around and the crew already knows that the heads need to come off, it helps the performers from feeling like they're nagging or holding up the production, providing them relief rather than stress. Now, I'll interject here and add that even with my limited on-set experience, this is something that I noticed from quite early on. Generally, unlike most jobs, on a film set, pretty much everybody wants to be there. That isn't always the case, but it's a greater percentage than most jobs that I've been involved in. Even when the day gets tough, it's the kind of tough that's rewarding, because you're all working together on a tangible goal. You're making a movie, you're making the day, and at times you're just down to making the shot work. As much of a blessing as it is to have such a collaborative and productive atmosphere, sometimes that can be a hindrance rather than a help. It comes down to the personalities you find on a film set. The kind of people interested in performing in an animatronics suit is not the same type of person you might find on the trading floor at Wall Street. Again, these are generalizations, but there is some truth behind it. There are egos at times, but on the whole, people are usually more interested in being a helpful part of something bigger than themselves, rather than trying to move their own career higher. Not saying that those are completely mutually exclusive, but usually one outweighs the other. This does, though, become a problem when limits are not respected. There are reasons why safety, intimacy, stunt, and other coordinators exist on a set. When you're in the middle of a machine rolling at 7,000 RPM for 14 to 16 hours a day, and burning at times millions of dollars an hour to make it all happen, it's easy to get tunnel vision and just keep pushing, especially if you're in the director or producer's chair. Part of that tunnel vision is a result of not taking into account reasonable limitations of the performers on set, because you're focused on the time and money limitations, and the fact that if we don't get this shot right now, we're never gonna get it and the movie's not gonna work. The reality of the situation is that it is really rare for that one shot to truly exist. Part of the art of the editing bay is making everything work together, usually as a result of things not going to plan on set, because they never do. Ask any of the greatest film directors of all time, and you'll know that almost every time, the first cut of the film is horrible, at least from their perspective, because it doesn't match anything close to what they had envisioned. That's not because of their lack of ability, that's just Murphy's Law in action. But even with that in mind, it's still easy to get caught up in the fuss. And from the perspective of the performers, they know all of these variables just as well as the crew, and as a result of the collaborative nature, they'll push themselves harder and longer than they might otherwise. This is in line with what Kevin was noting previously. The problem occurs when this grit becomes grind. If your performers push themselves too hard for too long, it can go from just being an annoyance to destructive to the cohesion on set, as far as genuinely getting unsafe. Exhaustion is a pervasive issue in the film industry, and it has killed. A prime example is that of camera assistant Brent Hirschman in 1997, after working a 19-hour day, concluding a week of 15-hour days on the set of Pleasantville. His is not the only death, and there are many others throughout the industry that often remark that falling asleep at a red light on the way home sometimes feels like the norm. With coordinators on set whose responsibility is to be the bad guy and enforce strict rules upon the rest of the production staff to ensure the safety for performers and the crew at large, it alleviates the other members from set having to pull double duty and enforce rules that may bring them undue stress and anxiety. When you're burning millions of dollars a day and the talent says they need a break, the frustration can become toxic, and it can be directed at them instead of the situation. But if you have a person whose job it is to be the metaphorical punching bag, it can even allow the performers the opportunity to be sympathetic to the crew. Maybe when the coordinator says, "We're done," the performer can say, "Come on, it's alright, let's do one more, we got this thing," turning the moment into a heroic triumph. It's these kind of psychological workplace politics that dominate the film industry because it's such a fast-paced, high-stakes profession, and you need a structure like that to allow the personalities of each crew member to be utilized to the fullest. Essentially, you're providing the performer the opportunity to maintain their existence on set as a source of positivity, keeping a collaborative and constructive relationship with the director and the other members of the production staff. This way, even if there are problems, even if there are delays, even if there is frustration, the production staff doesn't take it out on the performer, and it doesn't affect the performance as much, so you can keep the ball rolling. It's not only better for everybody else's psychology, it's also better for the production as a whole. The less you can have egos clashing, or even simply just frustrations mounting, the more productive the set is going to be. When you have this kind of structure, you get committed performers. And with that commitment comes reward, as Jess notes in the interview about how once they reach their breaking point in the schedule, she's able to take the helmet off, and as a result, she notices a complete change in her posture from the relief of the weight removal. Despite the physical requirements of the suit, it didn't inhibit their performances, and that's part of the result of the preparation they undertook. Kevin notes that they studied the games, watched videos, and had a 4-week rehearsal period, all to develop and fine-tune the movements within the suits. The first week was sort of a discovery week, testing different movements and positions to find out what looks animatronic. They spent a lot of time walking and learning how to isolate one movement at a time, because more than one movement, especially in different places, was a dead giveaway that they weren't actual animatronics. At least according to Kevin and the team of performers. They were so convincing that when the YouTubers visiting the set with Razbowski interacted with them, they still had no idea that anyone was in the suit, which surprised the performers because they'd been under the impression that they had already been made aware. For Kevin, this was the most rewarding part of the entire experience, and this is notable for 2 reasons. The first is the baseline when it comes to filmmaking versus other art forms, which is there is no direct feedback from an audience like in a theater or with live music. There is no way to know how the intended audience will respond. There's feedback from the production staff, and especially the director who you're in constant communication with, whose vision is being executed, which makes them particularly important in a filmmaking production. But in that way, the director is the only surrogate for the audience on set, which is limited in feedback capacity. Here, in this instance, with the YouTubers visiting set, they get a live audience to gauge just how their performances are coming across. And not only that, but it's also the audience arguably most critical and most important to impress. Because the visiting creators have such a rich history with the material, if they bought the performances happening directly in front of them, then it was likely the audience would too, making the moment exciting and reassuring for all of the work the performers had been doing up to that point. Because films don't have that physical audience on set, the performances need to be effectively captured through the movements on camera through lens and lighting. This is where many of the decisions of Moncrief and Mark come into play. The film utilized as many of the elements of the game as possible, one in particular being the framing of the camera within the pizzeria, utilizing the theme from the game of security cameras even in more standard setups, maintaining the feeling of something watching you. Cinematographer Lynn Moncrief notes that despite multiple lenses being used for various purposes, the majority of the film was shot on the DNA 45mm at t-stop 2.8, primarily for Mike, which provided the sharpness and contrast and the wideness they needed to contextualize him and his environment. The DNA 60mm at t2.0 was used for its dreamlike quality for Abby's scenes, and much of the final sequence of the film. This was Lynn's first film working with the Alexa 65, or any camera with that large of a sensor, as his experience is mostly with Super 35 size sensors, so he admits it took some time for him to get used to how the larger sensor changes the effect of the focal length of a given lens. As in addition to the previous discussion of sensor sizes, this is also an important note. Just as sensor sizes change the view of what's in frame versus not, they also affect the associated correlation between field of view and the lens length. There is a generally standard understanding of how a certain millimeter number on a lens correlates with its angle of view, or how many degrees of view are perceivable through the lens and onto the sensor or strip of film. However, when you change the size of that exposed area behind the lens, which is the sensor or the film, this also changes the angle of view, even if you're using the same lens. In today's world, where we have so many different sensors and sensor sizes, this can make it difficult to have predictability of output when interchanging lenses for different looks, and cameras for different capabilities. Extensive variables like this are why pre-production camera testing is more important now than ever in the aim of confirming the look of the film prior to recording anything of importance. Another lens used on the Five Nights at Freddy's film was the 21mm DNA, which Ari Rental House actually modified for this production by expanding the lens so it would cover the full Alexa 65 sensor, for getting extra close in those dream sequences. This lens was also used to capture all security camera footage within the film, allowing for the opportunity to use that footage in full frame at points in the movie without sacrificing image quality. The 57mm look lens from the Ari Heroes collection was used in 2 perspective sequences for both Abby and Mike, with an additional motor mount beyond the normal focus and aperture controls, which Lynn was able to rotate to tune the image as they drifted between different states of consciousness. In this context, tuning refers to the swirling of the bokeh, or the out-of-focused area behind the in-focus subject, essentially creating controlled optical movement within the lens itself. A 30mm 765 vintage lens was used specifically for Foxy, as it has a unique curvature that separated its style from the other DNA lenses, bringing a special element to Foxy's scenes in particular, which is fitting given Foxy's specific relevance within the FNAF community. On the last day of the production, they shot the VHS security guard tape, and in doing so, they filled the entire space with kids to be extras for the scenes. And in essence, they turned the set into the real Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria for an entire day. And at the end of that day, the lights went down, and it was time to go into post-production. Lynn notes that the production used 2 primary LUTs, or lookup tables, for the film, one for the main portion and one for the dream sequences. For those unfamiliar with what exactly LUTs are, they're basically just a means by which a computer can decode the information from a camera sensor on the back end to find a way to most accurately represent the colors that were captured in the way that the filmmaker wants them to appear. The primary LUT for the film used a distinctly filmic curve and a bit of desaturation. The dream sequence LUT had an increased contrast by comparison, and some softer tones for the blacks. Because Lynn knew they would be releasing the film theatrically, he chose to keep the ISO exposure levels at 800 ASA to avoid grain and noise in post-production. And for those wondering, ASA is similar to ISO, simply describing the sensitivity of the sensor to light at that setting. ASA was a rating developed by the American Standards Association, aka ASA, but is now called ANSI, or ANSI, as a linear scale to represent different photochemical sensitivities of various film stocks. For example, a 200 ASA film roll would be twice as sensitive to light as a 100 ASA film roll. This rating system went through numerous changes and updates throughout the 20th century, causing differences in consistency across time of how the films were even rated, with some versions of the ASA ratings being based on a logarithmic scale rather than a linear one. For these and many other reasons, the standard for light sensitivity has switched almost entirely to ISO ratings. However, for some who were brought up shooting on film rather than digital, like Moncrief, it's common to refer to ISO as ASA interchangeably. But it's worth knowing that all digital cameras of today refer to light sensitivity of the sensor as ISO. Now granted, there are still film stocks that refer to their sensitivity as ASA, but that is the major delineation between digital and film, at least in terms of rating to light exposure numerical values. Nevertheless, by the time Lynn saw the film projected on a 40-foot screen for color grading, he was surprised to see just how well the Alexa 65 had performed in retaining detail in the shadows and minimizing digital noise across the board. Unfortunately, there's just really not much else that's publicly available about the post-production of this film. The color and finish were done by Company 3, with Mitch Paulson doing the color and the finish edit done by Jennifer Raymond. I couldn't find anything on the editing software utilized, but I was interested that they had credited some images and illustrations to iStock and Getty Images, and stock media to Pond 5, all services frequently used by YouTube creators to find relevant stock images and footage for their videos. Sound services were provided by Pacific Standard Sound. The score was produced by the Newton Brothers and mixed by Jonathan Wales, with choir elements by Trinity Boys Choir and London Voices, conducted by David Swinson. The music was recorded and edited in Pro Tools, which was the audio standard up until at least when I was in college, as we had to learn how to use it to a basic extent, but I genuinely don't know how much it's changed. And with that, we enter the final stages of the film, its release. As the film neared completion, the time came to rev up the marketing material to let people know that the time was almost here. As with most film campaigns, posters and 2 trailers were put out, the initial teaser and a full theatrical trailer, which all received generally positive reviews, especially from fans, and accumulated over 400 million views combined. The primary cast and crew also did the standard press tour interviews, and there was even a San Diego Comic-Con panel with director Emma Tammi and producer Jason Blum. But the marketing went even deeper. A key component for the FNAF film launch was utilizing the existing fan base and key members within it, specifically the YouTubers with massive audiences who played and reacted to the games. They were involved through what mainstream media platforms would call user-generated content, or UGC, but it essentially just includes any creator's YouTuber social media video that was created in affiliation with the movie. This is probably the most effective strategy, as the primary target audience were the exact people already watching these creators. And when the film was finally released, the campaign seemed to have worked. Five Nights at Freddy's was released in theaters and Peacock simultaneously on October 27, 2023. And by the end of opening weekend, the film had already made $80 million, which was quadruple the $20 million filming budget. And taking into marketing, double the overall budget, most likely. By the end of the theatrical run, however, Five Nights at Freddy's became Blumhouse's most profitable film of all time, grossing nearly $300 million. Five Nights at Freddy's, in all of its formats, is one of the most expansive and popular story universes in the world today. It has an incredibly dedicated and loving fan base, and as a result of that dedication, the Five Nights at Freddy's film saga will continue. We know that Matthew Lillard signed a 3-movie deal with Blumhouse, and that the second of those 3 films is coming out this Friday. Time will tell how well it does, but knowing the nature of the fans, I have no doubt that it'll be a success. This was a fun one. There's a lot in here that I learned about this film that I just totally didn't expect. First primary element being that I would never have guessed that this film was shot on an Alexa 65. It's like what Dune and such is shot on. Like, it's a camera that is usually meant for like big scale, horizons and sunsets. And some of the other elements of like the puppeteering and things, but I guess this is a prime example of like, you don't have to just use the gear that you're supposed to, or that, is expected to be used in certain instances. I think Tammi did a great job of, making choices that fit her style. And this is a prime example of like, you're just going to do what you need to do in order to achieve your vision. And clearly it worked for her and everybody else who was part of the production and the cast. So yeah, this is really fun to dive into. Learned a lot, just like I did last time. Really looking forward to continue doing this, because I just, I feel like I'm diving into a world that I've kind of been circling around for the last few years. I haven't gotten an opportunity to really explore as much as I'd like. But this is a great kind of like next step for me. So appreciate you guys watching, appreciate the support. You guys watching this lets me learn more, so eventually when, I get a better opportunity to make actual films, I'm actually going to have some semblance of an idea of knowing what I'm doing. Film school is not enough to know what you're doing, just putting that out there. Never is, no matter what film school you go to. Still worth going, but just know that you're not going to leave film school and be ready to be Scorsese. Absolute cinema. But yeah, really cool, really fun. Looking forward to continuing this, doing the next one. Within the next week or two, that next film will be Heat. I'm really excited about that one. Should be fun, should be interesting. No puppets this time. Had to take a little break from that. Didn't want that to become too much of a recurring thing here. We'll see. Time will tell. Anyway, thanks for stopping by. My name's Aiden. Appreciate you checking out Silver Retention, and I hope to see you next time.